Hello and welcome to Let's Talk at the EUGENE BACH Festival. I'm Fred Crafts, Eugene's ambassador for the arts and your host for this series. And today, is it too loud? Well, that's at first. No, exactly. This series is brought to you by the Allergy and Asthma Center of Eugene. Let's thank them for making this possible. So today our guest is the Artistic Director Designate, Matthew Halls. Let's welcome him to our program. I am still breathless from the performance you gave the other night to the Passing of the Baton concert. Just absolutely wonderful. And especially the ending work, the James MacArthur choral piece. How did that piece strike you?
Very difficult. It was, James Macmillan is a fabulous composer, a very religious man, living, I suppose, quite a secluded life in Scotland, a very modest man, a brilliant musician. He's also a conductor. He works regularly as a guest conductor, so he understands musicians, singers, orchestral players very, very well. And he always writes in such a way which just sort of pushes you to the edge of what's possible. And a couple of audience members said to me after the concert, it was one of those experiences where they couldn't quite work out exactly what was going on. It was a bit like cosmic noise at times, you know, and I think that's James's brilliance. He's always challenging what the human voice is capable of doing. But within the context of all the things that have influenced him in life and in his own music, you can always hear in his music the background of bagpipes and Scottish ornaments. He uses a lot of the da-da-dum figures. And I wish we could just perform the piece again for you now and I could just explain a little bit. It's a shame, but you will hear it again. You will hear it again. I think that James is always mixing that with the solemnity of plain song and his Catholic background. And he comes up with these extraordinary sound worlds. You know, he takes you to different places with each of his works, but I have to say it was unbelievably difficult to perform. I mean, hats off to the Berwick Chorus because we had to rehearse it in a top secret location, usually at very antisocial hours of the morning, and we had a couple of security breaches where the door opened in the middle of our rehearsal, and you've never heard a choir stop singing quite so quickly. It was a joy to work on that piece. I think for me, if I can just explain, the piece took on a whole new level when we discovered, and we really had to search hard for it, it took a while to twig that this was happening in the piece. James has buried in the middle of the middle section a Bach chorale, note for note, Herz Licht tut mich verlangen, or in another setting, O Sacred Head Sore Wounded, a very, very well-known Bach chorale. And in rehearsals, I had these bizarre experiences where I could sort of hear some recognisable harmonic progressions coming through. He buried it so heavily in the decoration that it wasn't obvious, and it's written very slowly in augmentation, so you would have to really concentrate to hear it. But when you find it, and you see it there, buried in the second soprano, second alto, second tenor, second bass, it's unbelievable, because you can't hear it in the performance, because he's decorated it, he's embellished it, but he hasn't changed one note, and that is pure genius, really.
Well, this has been an artistically fulfilling and symbolically touching season, which says a lot about the future of the EUGENE BACH Festival. This, of course, is a year of change for us. Rilling steps down after 44 years, and you step in, so can you clarify for us what next season might look like?
We have an expression in the office at the moment which I started off, which is goes something like, I could tell you, but then I'm going to have to shoot you.
Yeah, right.
Let me just explain the reason why we're not really wanting to talk too much in depth, although next season is very, very well planned, and almost ready to announce, but it's simply because none of us are really thinking about next year, this summer. It's, we're all happy to be here as part of the celebrations for the end of Helmut's unbelievably long tenure at this festival, and to celebrate everything that he's done for this community. So I'm happy to give you some themes and to talk a little bit about how we're developing, how we're stretching the programs, and that I can do. What I can say is that it should look like a recognizable Oregon Bach Festival. I'm not trying to turn it into an international country dance symposium. We're all safe. And when you see the programming, you'll see all the distinctive elements of the Oregon Bach Festival. You'll see a celebration of a major symphonic choral work at the end of the festival. There will be a huge piece of Bach, which you won't have heard before, in the middle weekend. We will be opening the program with an absolutely wonderful pre-Bach work. So we're really challenging the parameters, if you like, of the repertoire that we want to explore. It's quite difficult to program a major Bach work when actually Helmut has devoted a lot of his time in the last 3-4 years of his tenure to performing those pieces. So I've had to think a little bit outside the box, and I think that we've come up with a very special solution which will be quite unique to the Oregon Bach Festival, and when that's announced, what I'm saying now won't sound quite so cryptic. There are several interesting themes running through the festival. We've always had this idea of themes binding concerts together. We are introducing a major new educational initiative in the form of an international organ masterclass, which will focus in the first year on the organ music of J.S. Bach, but not only that, but on the use of the organ in ensemble as well, and we shall be featuring much more this wonderful instrument that we have in the Central Lutheran Church, and trying to bring in another group of important musicians, i.e. the organist community, to this festival, and to bring them and involve them and engage them in our activities. You will hopefully be seeing much more of our young conductors. It's my aim to develop that program in such a way that they are in the public eye a little bit more, and that we will be watching them and rewarding them at the end of the festival for their extremely hard work, in addition to the continuation of the Discovery series. As you all well know, Helmut will be back next summer. It's a little bit like a do-si-do. That's an English country dance metaphor, but I've been coming for the last 3 years for a certain amount of time during the festival and doing a limited amount, and Helmut has of course been doing the lion's share. Next year it's just a slight change in that balance, and I'll be taking more concerts, and Helmut will be in residence and doing one main stage production, and he'll be doing a lot of teaching and also sharing the Discovery series lectures with me. So we will, in essence, it should look pretty much like this summer, but new music, new educational projects, a lot of Bach, more pre-Bach than this year, and that's pretty much all I can say at this stage. And quite an interesting commission from an American composer for the SFYCA next year.
Pretty good. You okay with that? Is that all right? You know, Relling has programmed so much Bach at this festival, it's hard to think there's something out there that he hasn't done for us. There is, though.
You're going to push me on this, aren't you?
Yes, I am.
It just might be that there are some pieces out there by Bach that are incomplete or fragmentary. It just might be that somebody might want to spend a considerable amount of their summer 2013 turning it into a complete piece so that we can all enjoy our music.
And who would that somebody be?
Yeah.
This is going to be an exciting season next year. And so are you going to be doing the, what you might call it, new music, contemporary music at the festival?
Absolutely. I think that, you know, it's always been central to the programming of this festival that we're seen to support our living composers. This year we have our Composer Symposium And that's a very, very important aspect of our work. I see that commissioning is hard. I should point that out. It's very hard to say to a composer, I need a major work by this date. And 6 times out of 10, it's still going to be pouring through the fax machine in half an hour before you go on stage. And that's white knuckle for musicians. It certainly happened here in the past. I'm mentioning no names. But we try and make sure that we're commissioning well in advance. And one of the reasons that John Evans was, of course, able to announce to you the other night that this Macmillan piece that you heard is part of a major work for 2016 is it sort of gives you some idea of the lead time that you need when commissioning major works. So James is already well underway on that project. And the piece that you heard the other night will form the last movement of quite a large cantata that James is writing for us all in 2016 for orchestra and choir. So that will be the first major port of call in terms of a big modern piece, but it's my wish that in each festival programme we are supporting other works already in publication by living composers, and particularly American composers.
We look forward to you as a performer as well. Are you going to be performing much in the future?
As opposed to conducting.
Mm-hmm. But that's a performance.
The musicians would like the humour in that. I think I have to be honest, and I have to say I'm obviously playing the harpsichord tonight in Bell Hall, and it terrifies me these days because I don't really get very much time to practice. And the last time I actually played the harpsichord in public was 12 months ago when John Evans asked me to play the harpsichord last year. So I only do it in safe places now, and I feel very safe here. So I'll keep trying it until you scream at me to stop. But there's a limit, and I think it's very hard. I find it hard to be a musical comedian, and I think the thing that really I love doing is conducting. And I think I've sort of accepted that the harpsichord is a private instrument for me now, and it's something that I like to do at home when I'm exploring. If I feel brave enough, then I will, play the odd piece from time to time, but I think there are people out there that do it better. And I think we can get excited about the idea of using OBF as a platform for inviting more musicians to pass through and showcase these instruments.
For the organ master class that you mentioned, who will be handling that?
We've engaged the wonderful Paul Jacobs, who we're very excited to say that Paul is, of course, a phenomenal organist, and his recital was so well received the other day, and we have immediately invited him, and he's accepted to run that programme in its first year. We're also trying, of course, to build ever stronger ties with the East Coast and with Juilliard in particular, because we have some education initiatives coming up a little further down the line, which really rely on networking with those sort of high-level institutions.
Will the Oregon BACH Festival continue its performance outreach around the state?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm engaged in that process at the moment. I've obviously only seen Eugene and Portland in my previous trips to this wonderful state, and last night I had the pleasure of being driven through the landscape, to Florence, and it sort of made me decide in an instant that I need to take a holiday out of it. I've never seen anything quite like that before. Unbelievably beautiful state we have here, and yeah, outreach is very, very important. We have a finite amount of time in which to do an unbelievably large number of concerts, so outreach will largely involve outsourcing concerts to groups like Portland Baroque, who can then galvanise a tour with a single programme. I think we already ask enough of our musicians here in Eugene, and we have to sort of make sure that we're not overdoing it on that front. But these centres, Corvallis, Florence, and Bend, and Ashland, I mean, I think it's wonderful. We've been taking music out there. I've played Brandenburg 5 many times in my life, but last night was quite extraordinary. It was a bit like a jazz concert. As there's this huge cadenza at the end of the first movement, and it's a scary ride, but as you can see the finish line, you always inside start to sort of give yourself a little bit of applause simply for arriving intact. But last night, the audience, a bit like being in the Village Vanguard really, they just started spontaneously to applaud as I was coming around to the end. And Monica Huggett turned around to me and said, "This is amazing. This is what century, you know, heckling and supporting, and it was just, it was a fantastic feeling, because I suppose they don't, I don't know what the music scene's like in Florence, but I had the feeling that this was something a little bit, you know, out of the norm, and maybe normal concert etiquette went out the window. I mean, we're always taught not to applaud in the middle of a piece, but of course, if we're talking about historically informed performance, we should be drinking beer and chatting with prostitutes. That's what used to happen in 18th century London. Where we draw the line, I think, is interesting.
Well, talk about the artists that you may have here in the future. Let's start with the festival orchestra. It is a festival orchestra. A lot of these people have been coming here for quite a long time.
Yeah.
Are you going to keep it intact?
Yeah.
Good. Chorus?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a very strong message to send out there. I'm aware, I've read some of the articles written in the local press, and I've also received feedback from people. There's been this confusion that people seem to think that I'm a guy that likes to do everything with just one singer and one violinist on stage. It's not me. I believe this is an enormous festival, and we set the bar very high for special events, and you're just not going to walk into the Silver Hall and hear Bach performed with one violin and with one singer. Where the change has to come a little bit, and I put my cards completely down there, is that if we do want to explore pre-Bach repertoire, some of the instruments that we need to do that don't actually exist in the modern orchestra, so we will have to think outside the box for that, because it's not possible to do that music with the orchestra that we have at our disposal. But there will be other things for that orchestra to do. So I think those of you who are really interested in historically informed performance, whatever that means, on original instruments, there will be more of that. There will be an increased presence, both from within and also in the importing of other groups and ensembles to showcase that. But the core of the festival absolutely stays, which is, you know, the wonderful work of our modern orchestra and of our symphonic chorus.
And the other thing about the Bach Festival, it has had a lot of great performers here, but they've become part of the Bach family, Bach Festival family. I'm wondering about some of the ones we have currently, like Tamara Wilson. Will she be back?
If I have anything to do with it. I mean, I think we're all agreed that that's quite a phenomenal voice, and the evening that we spent at the opera was one that I'll never forget. Sammy always makes a joke out of the fact that she finds it quite amusing that she's a featured artist almost annually at the Oregon Bach Festival. And a lot of her colleagues at the Houston Grand Opera certainly rib her about this, because, you know, she's mainly known for her amazing achievements in Verdi and Verismo roles. And, you know, also, she actually said to me just before she left at the airport the other day, you know, my dream is really to sing Monteverdi. I don't know how serious she was. I'm going to have to write to her. But I mean, I think, you know, one of the things this festival does so well, it's loyal and it supports artists that bring incredible work to this stage, and that's a work ethos that I support wholeheartedly. So we will continue our associations with these brilliant visiting artists, but we will also be introducing, as one would expect, new artists alongside, and trying to give variety within the context of continuity.
Can you name us some of the new artists that you have in mind?
I can't. Oh. Sorry.
I'm trying, folks. Let's talk about an artist that has been here for a long time, performed last night at Bell Concert Hall, Jeffrey Kahane. Yeah. Will he be back with us?
Well, I love Jeff's work, and in fact we only met for the first time this year. It's a bit of a joke between us that we usually miss each other in airports by about 10 minutes, because there's so many times when I arrive to conduct an American orchestra and he's the next guy on the roster for the next week, and we almost pass in the airport. And, we work for a lot of similar groups. He's obviously had a strong association with Colorado Symphony for many years, and I work quite regularly with that group. Yes, I mean, he's loved locally, and he's a very, very important part of this festival. I think it's always a tricky balance as an artistic director. You've got to provide variety, but you've got to keep bringing the treasured guests back. And I think, you know, one of my main concerns is just to make sure that we are always opening up new access points for artists to come and perform here, whilst retaining our relationships with existing artists. I would become worried if we were just doing a festival which every year featured the same artists. I mean, you're going to get bored of me after a certain time, and that's one artist that's going to be coming back year on year for a few years. But I think I need to provide variety whilst supporting these long-term relationships with people like Jeffrey Hayne and Bob Levin, of course, and his wonderful wife, Yaki Schweng. These are world-class artists, and they choose to come and do their best work here in our Bell Hall or in the Silver Hall. And yeah, it's wonderful that we have those connections with these artists.
Kind of pressing the point, because nor do we want a festival that, like a lot of jazz or rock and roll festivals, which are just bringing in the guest stars. It has no core to it. You're
right, yeah, we have a core. The core is well in place, and that's part of the beating heart of the festival, and I think it's... We went outside the box last November. We were looking at all the practical difficulties of planning a festival. It's increasingly hard these days to get visas for foreign artists to come and work in this country. I think, you know, my American colleagues will remind me that it's also very difficult as an American artist to get a visa to go and perform in the United Kingdom. We could perhaps have talks to improve that situation, but I don't think it's going to happen overnight. What that means is that we have to be very careful about the balance between European artists coming over and featuring American artists. So knowing that the rules on the visas were being tightened even further, we held auditions in New York, open auditions for vocal soloists last November, and John Evans and I went over there. And we were working for 3 days, and we had an amazing response from all the American agents who sent their finest singers to us. And I just came away with the overwhelming feeling that there was a huge pool of talent which we can draw upon and which we can introduce to the festival, and which I'm sure you will absolutely love, which is closer to home. I'm not saying that we want to sever ties with European agencies and stop the flow of traffic, because it's mutually beneficial, and it's very important that we retain our international profile, but we have to carefully balance it, because it becomes ever more complicated to invite those artists.
Let's go back to talk about the educational component of the festival. That's PULT classes, okay? That's always been kind of a core part of this festival, the mission of the festival, very central to everything that goes on here, the education of the musicians as well as the public. You mentioned the master classes already. Talk about the Stanglin White Youth Choral Academy. Will that continue?
Absolutely. Yeah. I've just come fresh from a meeting with Anton Armstrong this morning. We've been planning next year, and it's very exciting. That is, I think, one of the great strengths of the festival. I think it's one of our finest programs. Every time I walk into a rehearsal room and listen to this fabulous choir sing, it raises the hair on my arms. It's just extraordinary. And the way Anton Armstrong works, both as a musical educator and inspirer of men, and a moral guardian as well. You know, everything comes under that syllabus. He galvanizes these teenage musicians in a way that I've never seen before, and I consider it one of the most exciting aspects of our education program here. So yes, that continues.
And I believe you talked last year about the possibility of an equivalent in the instrumental area, and all American orchestra. Is that coming along?
Yes, it is. We're already in deep talks with educational institutions and with possible sponsors about the planned initiative to set up a large-scale orchestral academy here in Oregon in 2 or 3 years' time. This needs a long lead-in time because it's a fairly major project, but we perceive that at the moment we are missing an opportunity to provide education programs for orchestral players, both on modern instruments and on historical instruments. That's the important thing. I mean, there are plenty of courses, summer schools that you can go on as an American symphonic musician, plenty of youth symphony orchestras offering those sort of programs. There is an organization two organizations in Europe. One is the European Youth Orchestra, and the other is the European Union Baroque Orchestra. And both orchestras were founded to provide a link. As a young musician, you feel like you're stepping off a cliff. When you leave conservatoire, university, You've no idea whether you're going to be able to float the boat, make a career. It's a very difficult time. And institutions like that are set up in order to bring all of those sort of people who are bursting with creativity and ambition and fueled to be professional musicians, bring them all into the same room, get them all switched on, get them to make contact with each other, and then it sends them back out into the world to form their own groups, take the initiative themselves. It trains them to be entrepreneurs. So much of grassroots music making is to do with entrepreneur spirit as well as being a talented musician. And these networking organisations bring people together from all countries in the EU, and from that many, many other things are born. I mean, I would say that looking in the period instrument world in Europe, I would very rarely walk into an orchestra where less than 90% of the performing musicians hadn't been through one of those organisations. It's an extremely high hit rate. And there has been a perception that there's nothing quite similar for what we do here. This is the sort of music that we do here for orchestral musicians. So we're really working very hard at the moment to try and fill that gap. I believe it was always Royce's desire that at some stage an orchestral academy would become a part of this. And I keep my fingers crossed that we can actually bring this into the OBF realm and make it a success story which will help to really give it a national and international profile beyond its current status.
I hate to say it, but the Oregon Rock Festival has a graying audience. What are you doing to attract, well, I can speak for myself as well. What are you doing to attract younger audiences?
I went to a marketing convention not so long back, and I was quite surprised by the conclusions that were being drawn. I suppose I rather naively assumed that if you want to get a diverse audience in your concert hall, you basically need to poach late teenagers, early 20-year-olds as a target audience. Apparently this is just untrue. It never quite works like that. The principle that marketeers are working on in Europe at the moment, which is where this conference was taking place, are basically looking at the idea that if, and there are so many variables in this, I'll try and keep it a short story rather than a longer story. Education syllabuses are changing all the time. Music is not quite as valued as it once was. Culture is, in general, on the decline, sadly, and we'll learn from our mistakes. I'm quite sure about that because history has sort of told us that that never works. So with that in mind, let's look at the positives. In the UK, I can't talk for America because I think that perhaps music education is not quite so accessible as it is in the UK. It's still very important that each child at school learns at least one instrument, takes part in the choir, takes part in the orchestra. So the theory is you plant the seed at that early age, and then there's a general acceptance that in teenage years that might wane. People don't necessarily want to hear classical music, but the seed's already planted. But the marketeers have noticed a phenomenon which they rather negatively refer to as the midlife crisis, whatever that means. And it's the moment when, I suppose, 15 or so years out of your studenthood, you realise that life is a heck of a lot more complicated than you once thought, and that the responsibilities and burdens on the individual are great. And that's when people start looking out for signs that say, come teach yourself Tai Chi, or come and do yoga, or come to the opera. And this is what people are really grasping over the other side of the Atlantic, that there's a target audience in mid-30s, late 30s, early 40s, who can very easily be persuaded when they're looking for a greater meaning in life, that music provides that. And there are brilliant initiatives on the South Bank in London to bring vast numbers of those people into the concert hall, particularly city bankers and lawyers and people who've had a long, hard day at the office. They're invited to come a little later in the evening, and they're invited to take a beer and a glass of wine into the concert. They have a radio talk show host introducing the concert and interviewing the artists. And it's all very informal, and it's an unbelievable success. There's also another venue in Berlin at the moment called Radial System, which is offering concerts on yoga mats. And this seems to be incredibly attractive. I did a concert there 6 years ago, and several people fell asleep, but they seemed to really enjoy it. I'm not saying that in order to build our audience base, I'm allowing you all to bring yoga mats to concerts, but I am saying that it is important. We've got to target that age group. We've got to reconnect. We all know the value of classical music. That's why we're sitting here now, and that's why we continue to support a wonderful festival like this. In order to preserve it, of course, in the long term, we constantly need to be regenerating the audience. And so one of my top priorities really is to find a way of doing that and to make this connection. But I'm not under any illusions here. It becomes more and more difficult. The odds are stacked against us. We've got a tricky economic situation at the moment. Younger people in general don't have the disposable income that they once had, so ticket prices can just tip them over the edge. There are all these challenges that have to be met in order that we fulfill this desire to build the audience from younger age. But it's a top priority.
Well, you mentioned the yoga mat concerts. Are you thinking of something kind of exotic like that?
What do you reckon? Answers on a postcard. I'm exploring all sorts of avenues at the moment. I'm particularly interested in the idea that, you know, we have this wonderful temple to music in Eugene. It's called the Silver Hall. We also have one of the best chamber halls in the Western world, in the Bell Hall. But I'm a great fan also of having other musical events happen in places where you might not expect it. I mean, just to pull an idea out of the sky, BACH in the Brauhaus, or where we can, this happens a lot. I read an article, was it the Philadelphia Orchestra? Either Philadelphia or Cleveland, they had a program which basically allowed their musicians to go out into restaurants and bars on a Friday night and perform impromptu concerts. And they were having enormous success with this because the pattern was that people were stunned by the presence of these amazingly talented musicians, and then they came to the concert on the Saturday night in the hall. There are all sorts of things that we can explore, but I think, having spent a bit of time in Eugene now, that there are spaces that we don't use, which other people go to regularly and we haven't engaged with yet, that we could perhaps explore in our future program.
What about the festival becoming a year-round event?
Somebody's got to feed my dog, Fred. I think that's a great question. It would be lovely, but then it wouldn't be the festival anymore. And I think what I feel about festivals, as opposed to seasons, you can go and hear high-level symphonic music here on a monthly basis with the Eugene Symphony. You can go and hear opera. You can go and hear ballet, and that all works on a seasonal basis. What makes a festival different from the norm is that we try and promote events which are events. We try and do things which perhaps other organisations haven't quite got the budgetary means to promote, and we try and keep within the parameters of our USP. What is it that the BACH Festival does? What are we about? And for me that means three things. We do three things which perhaps other local organisations don't focus on so much. The first is that we make Bach's music the centre of our festival. It always will be. The second is that we produce a wide array of educational programmes around our already busy concert schedule. And the third is that we've become very well known as a major festival for the promotion of large-scale symphonic and choral repertoire. That's our USP. And if we became an all-year-round, or even enlarged festival, of course, we'd see that diluted very, very quickly. And I think there's an intensity, there's a fieriness about a festival. I was thinking this morning as I woke up and looked at the bags under my eyes that think about 3-week-long festivals. For the musicians, it's a week extra, of course, because we arrive and already start preparing. But you sort of arrive with a gladiatorial spirit. And then I will pass through the departure lounge of Eugene Airport on Monday as a shadow of my former self. I already feel a little bit like a zombie, and I think there are many musicians who feel that it's part of being part of a festival. That's what it is. You give your all. You get things out of musicians that you don't get in a normal week, and that's what makes it so unbelievably exciting. So we have to preserve that. That's what a festival is about, and I think that's what we focus on.
Where will your home base be?
Home is a strange concept for me. What do they say? Home is where your heart is, and my heart is in many different places, but my hearth is in Derbyshire, in the middle of England, and that's where I was born and bred. It's where they film all these high-clothed period dramas on BBC television. And I come from a farming family. My grandparents were all farmers, and so there's a little bit of that in my blood, in my background. And I live in a cottage on an estate which is part of a farm, a sheep farm. And so we've just come to the end of the lambing season. So when I've been studying all my scores for the summer, I've also been helping out with the lamb. It's kind of a bizarre combination of things. But that's, when I'm not working, that's where I am, in my little remote country cottage with no noise and a very, very dodgy internet connection. And that's peace, and that's the other part of my life.
Then how do you put together this festival?
John Evans will tell you that there's a tiny patch of reception in the cow field. I go and stand there with my mobile phone. We can actually, it's not as serious as modern technology is readily accessible, and a lot of the meetings that we have and things are done in the normal way via internet connections. But that's the beauty, I suppose. But I feel as a travelling musician, I'm on the road for about 45 weeks a year. That takes its toll. So when I go home, I really need somewhere where I can switch off, and that's why it can't be an all-year-round festival.
I see. Okay. Well, you're gone so much. How do you maintain your health, your exercise, that sort of thing? Good food.
They tell me that conducting is very good for your heart. The actual circular motion is like yoga, and of course. If you've ever tried it, if we were naughty at school, the teacher used to get us to stand in the corner and do circles with the arms until it began to really hurt. Well, that's the sort of pain that you can feel as a conductor, because that's the level that you're working at. And in a normal conductor's day, that could be anything up to 8 hours. And that's a long time. That puts a lot of pressure on your body physically. So I try and do a lot of yoga. Actually, it's funny that we were talking about that a minute ago. I also do a lot of running to try and keep on top of my game. But I do recognise, and it didn't take me long to realise in this profession, that you have to be very physically fit to be a conductor as well as mentally astute. And the age-old problem, of course, is the jet lag. I always find it. East Coast I'm sort of getting better at now, because it's only a 7-hour flight and the time difference is, what, 5 hours or something. I can manage that, but I do get whacked when I come over here to the West Coast. I've got to practice that one a bit more. But it's those sort of things are almost greater than the musical challenges sometimes in our profession. I'm often saying to my conducting students, they ask me, how am I doing? Well, we won't really know until we've got you up at 5 o'clock in the morning, sent you to Heathrow, put you on a flight to Milan with the wrong scores in your bag. The Italian taxi driver's late picking you up, he takes you to the wrong hall, so you arrive frazzled, discover that you've prepared the wrong symphony, and then we'll see you. That's some days like that.
Wow. It was called the passing of the baton. I noticed that at some point in it you were conducting with the baton, and then you put it in your pocket. What was that about? I ask the tough questions, folks.
Yeah.
Stop it.
Some conductors rely on a baton. I've never wanted to become entirely reliant upon a piece of wood. I think a baton is tremendously useful in certain situations, but I think there's also a great skill and a lovely art to be learned in hand conducting. And as a young conductor, I was incredibly influenced by watching Boulez in London. He was working there all the time. Pierre Boulez would conduct Mahler symphonies with his hand like this. And it was extraordinary because there was no lack of precision. There was a gain in intimacy because it forces people to just look in a more astute way. He brought the musicians and galvanized them in a way that I'd never seen before at that stage. Why do conductors use a baton? I suppose the general perception is that a baton will increase the field of motion, so that if you make a small movement with your wrist, it becomes a rather large movement with the tip of the baton. So for clarity in a large ensemble context, it's important. I would always use a baton in an opera pit because it's so dark down there, and it helps with clarity. I suppose I generally use a baton with large choirs and orchestras. But for me, it's also to do with the sound. I'm obsessed with sound, and if I go to an orchestral concert, if I hear an orchestra play Ravel, and then I hear them play Beethoven, this would be a funny program, but if I hear them play, I don't know, Britain, I want to hear 3 different orchestras. I want to hear 3 different orchestral sounds. I think when I was a young musician, I was acutely aware of a tradition in the 20th century whereby our great orchestras considered their sound, the sound of the orchestra, greater than the sound of the music. That may be a little unfair, but there was an emphasis on, if you went to the Boston Symphony, for instance, you wanted to hear the Boston Symphony, not the Boston Symphony playing Beethoven. It was the Boston Symphony sound applied to Beethoven, and I sort of, I don't get that, because I want to be challenged. I want to hear different sound worlds. For me, Ravel, his orchestration is so different. It needs a different approach. Beethoven demands a different response from musicians. So I am obsessed with this idea of finding different sounds. And I suppose I will use any means that I can to try and promote that. So, for instance, in the concert the other night, I chose to use a baton for the Mendelssohn because we had a large choir on the stage. But for me, the Brahms is a much more intimate piece, with the exception of the raging middle section. And I wanted to use my hands for that. And it was the same in the opera program. I never plan it. I've become a master of the quick draw. It's only failed me once wearing a new pair of trousers in the Festspielhaus in Salzburg. They had slightly larger pockets and the baton fell out and rolled off the front of the stage. But in general, I can make the decision depending on how I feel with the orchestra. And there are some orchestras that I just love conducting with hands, and this is one of them. I did it for the first time with the Tippet, which is an extremely challenging piece. And I asked the orchestra if they minded, because particularly American orchestras are much more used to being conducted with a baton. In Europe, it's becoming much more fashionable to not use it. If you go to the Philharmonie in Berlin, or if you watch their wonderful digital concert hall online, which I can thoroughly recommend, you will see that almost as a mark of respect, most guest conductors go into that orchestra and use their hands. It's a stronger relationship, I feel sometimes. But I don't decide before the event, I decide in the moment.
Now, if I heard you correctly, you said you grew up on a farm. Is that right?
I spent a lot of time. It was my grandparents that were the farmers, not my parents. So we would spend harvest and summers on the farm.
So you grew up in a more urban situation?
Yeah, in the suburb.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you recall your first musical memory?
Well, my father's a church organist, so from I can't remember a time when I wasn't exposed to music. He would always sit down late at night and just play through Brahms. And those are my earliest musical memories. And I mean, he tells me that I was really quite a freak from the age of about 3 or 4, because at times I would creep down to the piano after he'd closed the lid and try and play what he just played by ear. And I think I learned music by ear for a good 5 years before a music teacher rapped my knuckles and said, "You're not going to get anywhere unless you actually learn to read the notes." Thank goodness they said that, because it is quite helpful.
So was it your intention to be a keyboardist?
No, it was my intention to be a musician. I realised that it was a form of expression that I couldn't live without from a very early age. I don't know. There's so many things about being a musician that I really don't understand, except that I need to do it. I think a lot of musicians say things like that. Somebody said something the other day, I think it was Chia, and she said that her whole life is filtered by music. You know, there's never a time, and it can be annoying, certainly for your family members, when you'll be going to the cinema and you've got something going on in here and you're thinking about something that you've just been studying or practicing. It's hard to turn it off. and generally to completely turn it off, we have to break away from life completely and be quite secluded. I find that that's a common pattern with a lot of my colleagues, but I always wanted to be a musician, and I wanted to see where the career would take me. I wasn't sure that it would work when I left university. Like everybody, I was very nervous, but I decided to dip my toe in the water. At that stage, I wasn't even a harpsichordist. I mean, becoming a harpsichordist was a complete accident for me. I was a pianist and an organist, and I trained as a romantic musician. And some of the earlier recordings that I made were of Olivier Messiaen's organ music and Maurice Duruflé. I didn't really play much Bach until I was 21. And then I got a phone call one night from a musician who had heard me step in as a harpsichordist in an ensemble. She happened to be the concert mistress of the Amsterdam Baroque Orchestra. She said, "Can you get on a flight tomorrow morning and come and audition to Tom Koopman?" And I said, well, you're fearless as a student. You'll do anything, really. I wouldn't do it now. But I did get on the plane, and I prepared a score overnight for him, and he was very generous. He obviously saw some potential, and he could see that my harmony was okay. And he took me on, and that was it. That was the moment that I connected with Bach's music. There was no preparing for it. There was no big journey preparing his music and being obsessed with his music as a student. It was an accident, but it was an amazing accident, because I joined Tom's group when he was in about volume 8 of a 24 series volume multi-disc cantata recording project. And I should think probably that I then spent over the next 7-8 years, a good 2 years of those in the recording studio with Tom, recording Bach cantatas and nothing but Bach cantatas. And as a young musician, that was, I mean, I've never had that opportunity again. I think recording companies, you know, they're also suffering at the moment. And the likelihood of any recording company saying, in this day and age, we'd like to give you this amount of money to record Bach's complete cantatas, it's very, very unlikely. So that was a unique privilege, and that was what fired me with enthusiasm for Bach's music, and also, you know, other things came of that, a love of Handel, a love of pre-Bach music in Germany and Italy particularly, and also my tutor at university, his great speciality was French classical music, the music of Rameau and Lully, and so there were a lot of diverse influences, but I really kicked against it for a long while, because at that stage I much preferred playing Liszt and Rachmaninoff, and so I went to the other extreme. And the beautiful thing is that now I find myself coming back, and I find a more permissible music scene where you don't have to be one thing or another. It's very easy to get pigeonholed as a musician, as either a Baroque musician or a contemporary music specialist, but the most rewarding and the thing that I'm most grateful for is that the music profession is now giving me the chance just to be a musician and to do the repertoire that I love to do. I would never take on board anything that I didn't really connect with in terms of repertoire. But the fact that I'm now able to combine a conducting career that takes me into the opera pit to perform Handel operas, but then the next week takes me to Washington to conduct Henri Dutilleux and Vaughan's symphonies, that's precisely the life that I wanted. So I do feel like the luckiest guy on the planet at the moment, because there have been a couple of us, early musicians, who have sort of broken free of the net. There's another colleague who I sort of grew up with called Andrew Manzi, and many of you will know his unbelievable recordings as a violin soloist. He made a similar decision about 6-7 years ago that he wanted to become a conductor. He wanted to reconnect with his childhood music. For him, the symphonic music of Brahms and Mahler, Bruckner. So he took himself off and took a music directorship in Scandinavia, stopped playing the violin completely, and is now the principal guest conductor of two of Europe's most prominent orchestras. And he's managed to make the change. And I think that it's only possible to make that now that we accept that there's not such a great big barrier between the two worlds. It's really, it's not rocket science. It's they're interconnected, and I do believe that I'm part of a generation of musicians that wills that barrier stops being there, so that you don't have to be one thing or the other. You can just be a musician again, which is what people always were in the past. You didn't hear people in Brahms's age saying, oh yes, he's a Renaissance specialist. Or maybe you did. Maybe that's unfair. Perhaps you did, but I don't think so. Not to the extent that we like to sort of pigeonhole performers these days.
In just general talking with you, I hear musical references dropped in your speech from all sorts of genres: jazz, pop, rock and roll. Do you follow jazz, pop, rock and roll?
What we say stays within these four walls. Did I tell you this before? You know exactly what you're probing for.
We'll find out.
There was a period in my teenage years when I was heavily into heavy metal, and this led me to become a disc jockey for 4 years. I had a little business when I was at high school, and I was a sound engineer freak, so I built the sound systems, and my guy was a lighting designer, my business partner. And I used to be a DJ. I used to do parties in some clubs, and so I do like that music, or I used to. I don't listen to so much of it. My great love in the pop world is Coldplay. I think they're one of the best groups around at the moment, and they just always remind me of home. It's a London sound, it's an urban chic sound, and they're unbelievably intelligent musicians, and if I have my way, I'd love to invite them here to do a cover band for I also love jazz. Every time I go to New York, I like to head down to the Village Vanguard, which was my first connection with the New York jazz scene. I'm not a great jazz musician myself. It sort of manifests itself in other ways. I like rhythm, but I've never really studied jazz playing. I'd like to at some stage, but just in private. So I do have very, very diverse musical interests. The other thing is that I'm quite well travelled in strange parts of the world, because for a long time my passion was to explore. I spent an awful lot of time in the Middle East. I've done a lot of teaching in Israel, but also other links have taken me to Syria and to Lebanon and to Egypt. I've been to all those places which are now a little bit dangerous to travel to as a tourist. This was in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. Sometimes doing concerts there, meeting musicians there. My other great passion is cookery. I took some cookery lessons over there, and I think that that introduced me to world music in a big way, and meeting a lot of indigenous musicians I found very inspiring. Again, I don't profess to be an expert on that, but I do love dipping into other cultures as far as music is concerned. It always has a very strong resonance. It always seems to come from the heart, and it's something which I find really interesting to listen to. So you could say that I have extremely eclectic taste, diverse interests, and it is nice once in a while not to be a classical musician. Distraction technique works quite well. There's no classical music in my car, let's say that. I generally listen to other genres.
And when you're running, do you use an iPod and listen to music?
I find running's a good time to learn scores, actually, because the scientists seem to think that if you're engaged in some sort of physical exercise that you learn at a higher rate. I try and memorize all my scores, and I find that I can do a lot of that actually when I'm running, so I tend to listen to a lot of music while I'm running. And sometimes I try and put the scores under my pillow at night in the hope that but it doesn't work.
Well, you seem like everything you perform, you've memorized, so this must be a rather fast process for you. How do you do it? Those of us who can barely remember our own phone numbers wonder how do you do so much?
Just study. I mean, I've always been obsessed by study. There's a part of me, I have a background in academia, so I'm always reading, I'm always studying scores. I would say that I get as much enjoyment sitting at home with my dog at my feet and just reading scores and studying scores as I do being out there on the road on the concert platform. And I consider that a really positive thing, because I consider that the two aspects are very, very important parts of being a musician. You can't have the one without the other. You can't be a great performer without intensive study. And the fact that I really enjoy that process makes the whole, the demands of the career that much more enjoyable. So firstly, I try and keep a very, very tight grip on my schedule. I try and make sure that there is enough space, that my guest conducting is interspersed with moments of repose. Even if it's just 4 or 5 days at a time, I try and allow breathing space for the study. And largely for me, the process of memorization is through analysis, by breaking a piece down into its components and by understanding the form and by studying the orchestration. To study orchestration is fascinating because every composer has such a different approach. So whilst learning a score, you also get to the heart of how a composer works as a practitioner. And that process I just find very, very stimulating. But I have to say, it's not something that I've always done. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and it was actually when I came here in 2011 and I watched HULT conduct from memory. I decided to be a bit braver. I sort of kept it as something that I might like to try in the future, but then I saw not many people are doing it. I mean, a lot of the showcase conductors, they tend to do it for the Beethoven symphonies, for the Brahms symphonies, the pieces that they've been performing again and again. But I suppose there's an element to the rascalish element that likes a bit of the fear factor. And I like to put pressure on myself because I do believe as a conductor that you have an enormous responsibility to the musicians that are working for you and working for you so hard. You have to be absolutely on top of your game. So I want to feel before I go into that first rehearsal that they already trust me, that they know I know the music, that there's no grey area here. They know that if they ask me questions, I will be willing to answer. So we establish a working rapport that can only come from exhibiting from the first notes of the first rehearsal that you really are in the music. And so that memorizing for me is not just a sport. In fact, it's not a sport at all. It's not. It's nothing other than just feeling that I don't need the score anymore. That there's no need to have it there. If it were there, I wouldn't look at it anyway. And it's part of letting music inhibit you physically. Because conductors, I think we've talked about this before, but it's in German you call it Dirigent, in French you call it Chef d'orchestre. Chef d'orchestre is such a wonderful title. In English we call it conductor, and nobody ever questions why we do that, because it's quite an odd name to conduct. The other uses of that word are more associated with electrical current, for instance. Well, I like that idea, because what it's suggesting is that the conductor takes in the music and then passes it back through physicality. He conducts. He doesn't direct, he conducts. He translates through physical gesture the content of the score. And I always keep that idea in mind when I'm trying to think, sometimes those long, long days when you can only go for too long. Why am I doing this? That plugs me back in, and that makes me remember what it was that I fell in love with about my chosen career path.
Well, we're certainly delighted that you chose that path and that you are with us. This is a transition year. Helmut's 44 years and in your hopefully 44 years and then some. So thank you for the wonderful festival you provided for us for this year, and for the previews of what the future might look like. There's some very exciting times ahead of us. We've come to the end of Let's Talk, so let's thank Matt.